states had a significant increase in the amount of op tempo that they had previously had, and so they've asked for additional force structure. Those decisions are made at the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of the Air Force level, and of course, like all organizations, we would like to grow if possible. When you look at that within each state, however, we work with the states to make sure that they have the personnel, and if it exceeds their capability, we have emergency management assistance compacts where they can reach out to other states to draw those resources in. Very similar to what we do during hurricanes, when in the case of one of the Gulf states where they're hit and it exceeds their capability, we meet every year beforehand to identify those forces that could come and meet those requirements. So until that time, we'll continue to use the emergency compacts we have between the states, but we're always ready to grow if the service secretaries agree to it.
All right, on the phone, Steve Banyan, military.com.
General, appreciate you taking the time out today to do this. I've been talking to a lot of guardsmen across a lot of different states. They're just not getting access to gear to train for the ACFT. It seems like this gear was sent to the states. It's locked up at some battalion headquarters, inaccessible to a lot of armories at the moment. And these guardsmen, they're having to go to CrossFit gyms or find their own equipment. They're not getting reimbursed or anything from the Guard. Is there any plans to get more gear to armories or help soldiers pay for finances related to their health and fitness?
So Steve, when we look at the new Army Combat Fitness Test, we were fortunate to be able to field all of 100% of our equipment to all the National Guard units. Now that it's in the system, the units can now additionally order other sets of equipment or augment what they currently have. And with any new test, what we're trying to do is really determine the best way to do this. And I've seen various states come at it from different directions. And within the Army National Guard, we're trying to share those best practices. Number one, to make sure that our soldiers have the ability to train for the test, and that when we do conduct the test, that it goes as smooth as possible and we can get everybody through in a timely manner. There's been a lot of great innovative approaches. I know there's some apps out there that you can download that give you events to train every day to get ready for that. I was fortunate, our entire staff took it a couple of weeks ago, and it's significantly different from the other one, but I would tell you each and every one of us actually felt like it was a very good challenge, and it was a very good test. But as we go forward, we need everybody to have that test by August 31st so we can actually get more data on what the actual scoring is and the capabilities of each and every one of our soldiers, and also to identify those events that they need to practice on. And so when we look at this, we're watching it very closely, staying in communication with the states to make sure that we can make it possible for everybody to have the equipment when they need it, and so they can train and be successful in that test.
Thank you. Here in the room? Yes, sir.
Yes, Abraham Massey, Washington Examiner. Thank you, General. Sir, there's been a high demand on the Guard in the last year. You described sort of a range that was happening in just one weekend. There's been a lot of reports lately that this is going to be the new normal. I wonder if you can reflect on, can Guard members, current Guard members, future Guard members expect that this is the kind of demands that will be placed on them? And then also, sir, would you comment on your vision for how Space Guardians would be used? What type of civilian jobs would you be recruiting for, would you benefit from?
Yeah, thank you, Abraham. So when we look at the demands on the National Guard, and I mean, last year was a great example. Not only did we have the COVID-19 pandemic, we had a historic hurricane season and also a historic fire season. One thing that we have done is we've become a lot better at how we do this. And I'll use fires as an example. So previously, prior to a hurricane season, we would all meet, identify the states most likely to suffer from hurricanes, identify their shortages. So this year is the first time we've actually done the same thing with wildfires. And in March, we had a meeting with the National Interagency Fire Committee to really look at what capabilities may be deployed and what capabilities are going to be here at home, and then identify those shortages so we can train those units so that they're ready to fill in and help with wildfires in a time that they need them there. So that's one thing. When we look at the future, however, we're not really sure what it's going to look like. But what we have to do is be prepared to meet whatever that demand signal is. And so what we try and tell our folks is, hey, we go back to our motto, always ready, always there. We don't know what we're going to be asked to do, but we've got to be ready to do that. And when we look at the op tempo of the past year, and I'll use the Capitol response as an example, I spent a lot of evenings out there with our soldiers and airmen talking to them. And universally, they said, hey, this is what we signed up to do. For many of them, it was their first trip to the nation's capital, but they felt very proud to do their part. Now, over time, we'll see. We keep in very close touch with each of the states to help, once again, find that balance between civilian career, military career, and family so that we can sustain that. One indication we use is our recruiting and retention. And, having previously served as a director of the Army Guard, a lot of times the end of the fiscal year is the end of September, and we would meet our recruiting goal in late September. But with respect to the Army National Guard, we met our recruiting goal in May of this year, which is historically early, which shows that a lot of our Guardsmen have re-enlisted or decided to stay within the organization. And also our recruiting's been up as well. And we're very close tracking on the Air National Guard as well. So I would say, based on the ability for us to recruit and retain, that's a good indicator that folks are aware of that. Now, with respect to the potential Space National Guard, folks may not realize, but the National Guard has actually been conducting space missions for over 25 years. We have over 1,000 space professionals in the National Guard, and we really look forward to them transitioning from the Air National Guard to hopefully a Space National Guard in the near future. And with mission sets like that, many of them already work in the civilian industry, and that's one of the great benefits of the National Guard is we leverage not only their military training, but many of them bring their civilian skill sets to work, which makes our organizations even better. And vice versa. A lot of the leadership skills and training that they receive in the military help benefit their employers and their companies. So for us, it's a win on both accounts.
Is there any specific sort of civilian areas or more broadly, like what the vision might be for changes?
Yeah, so with respect to changes, any growth or changes in mission sets will be directed by the Secretary of the Air Force as the Secretary for the Space Force. Under our current mission sets, we plan to basically continue those until sometime in the future. But in many cases, you'll see that they're located near businesses or areas that have really compatible civilian jobs as well. And that's one advantage. Our Guardsmen, they're Guardsmen for a reason because they want to have the civilian career and their military career.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
On the phone, Alex Horton, Washington Post.
Hey, thanks for doing this. So my question starts 50,000 years ago, or 57,000 years ago, when Minot 1, the oldest living human that is important to understanding the links between humans and Neanderthals, died somewhere in a cave in what we now call Israel. That number is important because that's how many years was spent by Guardsmen on duty in 2020, 57,000 years worth of time. When I asked you about this in March, about the burn rate and assessments on what that has done for the force, what is needed to refit and assess what kind of wear and tear this put on, people's careers, equipment, their civilian side of the house. You didn't indicate there was any kind of assessment or learning opportunity there. I'm curious if the answer is different now. A few months later, you had mentioned that just now that recruiting and retention is a good sign that people are emboldened by the mission. We're also coming in out of one of the worst economies since 1929. So perhaps that is also playing a role in people re-enlisting. So I'm curious to hear, once you're kind of climbing out of this unprecedented year of the Guard, what is your deeper look at the costs bared by your people and what you intend to do as you look to fulfill a deeper mission set in the future?
So Alex, thanks for that question. And when we look broadly across the organization, of course, you mentioned recruiting and retention. That's one of the key indicators. But for us also, it's really looking at a lot of the, every time I visit a state, I usually meet with the senior leaders to have a conversation about them and what they have learned throughout their career. And then I also meet with the recruiters to hear what they're hearing from the young men and women that are coming into that organization. So it kind of gives me a broad picture of what the system has produced and what the system is bringing in and the motivations behind that. And one interesting thing that we see is when we look at folks, why they come in, number one, it's a sense to serve. Many come in for educational benefits and for the training. And what we're also finding is some, what we would traditionally consider older adults in their late 20s, early 30s are now coming into the National Guard because they want to make a difference. And so we've noticed that the demographic has shifted slightly, but not significantly. But for us, we need to make sure that we very much stay in tune with that. And the other thing is going back, and you highlighted a couple of things when you look at the economy over the past year as well, is making sure that we're well connected with our states to understand those environments where the economy may be really starting to pick up again, and a lot of the guardsmen need to get back to their civilian careers, and sometimes those civilian careers will ask more of them than they had in the past as they get up to speed again. So we have to really work very closely with the adjutants general so that we can meet their requirements and do everything we can to reduce the burden on our guardsmen to do those mission sets that are critical to our nation and to our community, but then sometimes get away from some of those mission sets so that we reduce the burden on our personnel. And it's an ongoing thing that we really have to monitor very closely every single day. And really it goes down to our leaders at the lowest level, having that level of communication with our guardsmen so they understand, the pressures that they feel between their civilian career, their military career, and their family. And one thing otherwise that I mentioned really in my opening statements is how much I support really TRICARE Reserve Select for all of our service members. And this is one of those things that we did learn over the past year, is when you go from a civilian career and you get on orders for more than 31 days, you go to TRICARE Healthcare, but then in many cases you may have to switch providers. And if we had TRICARE Reserve Select for all of our service members all the time, they'd be able to maintain that continuity of care, and also the employers and the families would know that if they're injured either on or off duty, that they're going to be taken care of so they can return to duty, return to work, and also be there to help provide for their families.
Thank you. In the room? Louis?
Hi, sir. Louis Martinez with ABC News. If I could ask you two questions first about January 6th and the reaction to that. You mentioned the 521 million right now. Have you received assurances from members of the Hill that you will be receiving that compensation either this fiscal year or if not in the next fiscal year? And what is the difference if you get it now as opposed to getting it next? And then I have a different question.
So we're working very closely with our congressional representatives, and I know as the Department of Defense is as well. And it's critical for us to get it this year because of the funding will be required for us to complete not only our drills, but all operations and training we have scheduled in this fiscal year.
And then the response, 5 months long, I think it was. A lot of coordination. I think this is probably the largest collective National Guard response that we've seen in the continental United States. When you have literally all of the states contributing. What were some of the lessons learned from that response and how you prepare for something like that in the future? And also, how do you bridge this disconnect that there seems to be between the popular perception of how the National Guard can be used as a quick response force versus how it actually operates, and how the interpretation is that yes, the response here was actually quick, but it's very different.
Louis, thank you. So if you go back to the initial response itself and the things that we learned, what we found is the investment that our nation has made really since 9/11 in the National Guard in terms of our manning, training, and equipping. It has produced a force that can literally do just about anything we're asked to do. And our ability to move 26,000 guardsmen from really every single state territory to include Alaska and Guam came here as well. Our capability there is number one because we had Air National Guard organic assets to help move, but also our personnel are used to mobilize and deploying. And also the support we got across the 54 as a result of January 6th. Every single state, as I mentioned, all 3 territories and DC provided personnel to meet every single requirement that we were given. So that's one thing that we learned. The investment that our nation has made really made that possible, and the training and professionalism of our force. When you look at the responsiveness of the National Guard, and what we try and tell folks is, our motto is always ready, always there, but the majority of our personnel have civilian jobs. And so for them to leave their civilian job, return to their armory, get their equipment, get a briefing, and sometimes last minute training on what specifically they'll be asked to do, we really look at that as a 24-hour time frame. We're not a SWAT team. We're not law enforcement. We're soldiers and airmen trained, man-trained and equipped to fight our nation's wars. But the leadership and the training that we get also, as I mentioned earlier, allow us to do just about anything our community's asked. But we can't get into the perception that we're immediate response, because we're just not resourced to do that. And so we really rely, obviously, on local law enforcement, and if it exceeds their capability in a timely manner, normally 24 hours is when we can start marshaling our organization to help support.
If I could just follow up, does it make sense to establish national response forces that could tighten up that time frame?
So when I look at that, Louis, many of these I think are actually a law enforcement mission set, and therefore I think it's most appropriate to have law enforcement do that. When you look specifically at the National Guard, our full-time forces are really there to really train and administer our organizations so they're ready to do their warfighting mission. They're not specifically designed for anything like that. Thank you.
All right. Any last questions? Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon. And thank you to everybody on the phone as well. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. What was all that for?
The bipartisan infrastructure proposal, were those fruitful discussions, and where does that go from here? Is the president going to be hosting any of those senators here at the White House in the coming days?
If we continue to make progress in these discussions, then the president looks forward to welcoming members to the White House before the end of the week. We'll see. There were two rounds of discussions yesterday, and I know you're all aware of this, or many of you cover this closely, but there was one in the afternoon. There was another one last night. Additional progress was made last night. This afternoon, Steve Ricchetti, Louisa Terrell, Brian Deese are all back up on the Hill right about now, having continued discussions about the path forward. That's one track where we are moving forward on these bipartisan negotiations, and we assess as we conclude each round what the next step should be. So again, if we make progress and if we assess that that it is the appropriate time to bring these officials, these elected officials to the White House, the president looks forward to doing that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. So about today's announcement, why is the vice president visiting the border this week when earlier this month she dismissed a trip like that, saying it would be a grand gesture?
She also said in an interview with NBC that she would be open to going to the border if it was an appropriate time. She said that after she said that. So that's important context as well.
Okay, and important context, I've got the NBC interview right here. She was talking about how she hasn't been to the border, she hasn't been to Europe either. So does she think that these two things are the same?
And again, Peter, I think she also said in the same interview that she would be open to going to the border at an appropriate time. And what I'm conveying to you is that, as a part of her assignment, she has, of course, hosted a number of bilateral engagements. She's visited the Northern Triangle. She's made a number of announcements about how to address root causes that was going to assess with the Department of Homeland Security and with the administration when it was the appropriate time to go. And I will note that we're at this point in part because we've made a great deal of progress. And if you look just to a couple of months ago, when 6,000 children were in Border Patrol facilities, we're now at the point where there's far less than 1,000. If you look to just a couple of months ago, when there were children who were waiting in Border Patrol facilities for more than 100 hours, and they were certainly overcrowded, now it's less than 30 hours. In April, there were 22,000 kids in HHS facilities, and now that number is 14,000. Is there still more work to do? Absolutely. That's the purview of Secretary Mayorkas, but it's important every component of our government is coordinated.
Was it important for the White House to have her seen at the border before former President Trump has a trip there next week?
We made an assessment within our government about when it was an appropriate time for her to go to the border.
And then just one about the crime today. You mentioned expanding
The crime prevention rollout.
Prevention, yes, not the crime. But there is a lot of crime in big cities. How do you reduce?
Much of it caused by gun violence. Would you agree?
Yes. So how do you reduce gun violence by expanding employment opportunities, including summer jobs for young people?
Well, first, there's several components of this proposal. One of them is an initial set of actions on gun violence, or an additional set, I should say, of steps on gun violence, which the president feels are important to get guns off the streets, make sure they are not in the hands of people illegally, many of whom are playing a role in violent crime across the country. That's part of his objective. He also wants to provide, as we've seen, has been effective in communities across the country, incentives and alternatives for young people and communities where that has shown to be an effective step.
So is the thought there basically that some criminal who has been committing crimes with limited interruption or interference from police for the last couple of weeks or months is going to stop this easy life of crime if they have a summer job?
Well, I think the president believes that we shouldn't allow access to guns to those criminals who are currently illegally buying them from some dealers across the country. And part of his announcement is taking steps to do exactly that. But part of his announcement is also ensuring there's specific guidance to communities across the country to ensure that they have funding to get more community police around the country. Something that was supported by the American Jobs Plan that was voted into law by Democrats just a couple of months ago. Some might say that the other party was for defunding the police. I'll let others say that, but that's a piece. Go ahead.
Would you concede there is a political calculation to having the vice president visit the border before Donald Trump goes, and with a drumbeat from Republicans who have counted the days that she has not visited the border? Isn't there a political decision in the timing of this?
Well, Kelly, I would say that we have no way to predict what former President Trump will say when he goes to the border. We can only guess, but I don't think our view is that the vice president making a trip to the border with the Secretary of Homeland Security to assess and take a look at progress that's been made is going to prevent or change what the former president of the United States says when he goes to the border in a couple of days. Oh, go ahead. Did you have another question? Go ahead.
Senators, including Senator Tester, are saying that they believe they're at really the kind of razor's edge moment with deciding the pay-fors for infrastructure. Can they go forward? Do you feel that there is the possibility of some kind of a development within the next 24 hours? Would you agree with that sense of the timing? And is there anything new that the White House has offered for paying for these infrastructure programs that we have not learned of from you before?
Well, there's no question, as you know, it's much easier to negotiate with Congress when they're in session. So we're certainly hoping to make progress over the next couple of days. I'm not going to put it 24, 48. There's a couple more days in the week, and we're hopeful to make progress. If we see progress continue to be made between our discussions with our members of our senior team and members, then we look forward to welcoming Democrats and Republicans here to the White House to meet with the president. In terms of what we would offer, the president has offered a range of ways to pay for these proposals. And we've also we had so many options of how to pay for these proposals. We've even taken some of our own proposals off the table, including ensuring that individuals pay a higher rate for this specific negotiation, and also raising the corporate rate for this specific negotiation, even though we're keeping it on the table for later on to be very clear. But the bottom line, it's pretty clear and simple to the president. The choice for him on the pay-fors is, are you going to ask Americans who are just trying to go to work, just trying to drive their cars to work, drop their kids off at school, to pay more through a gas tax? Or should the wealthiest Americans pay what they owe in taxes? To him, that's a pretty clear no-brainer choice. That's part of the discussion, though. Go ahead.
Back to the president's crime prevention announcement today. You've noted that violent crime has been up over the last 18 months and several years. So what specifically prompted the president to come out and make this announcement today?
Well, there's a policy process that has been underway for the last couple of weeks and months even. We've had a series of announcements, as you know, over the past several months on gun violence prevention. Obviously, there was funding in the American Rescue Plan to support keeping cops on the street. And there are several components that were just prepared to be announced.
And you've made clear you're tackling this, as a gun issue. The president has urged Congress to take action on this. We have seen very little movement on the Hill. It's been years since we've seen sweeping gun reforms out of Washington. What is the president's message then to Americans who are concerned about rising crime in their communities? In order to achieve real progress, do they have to wait for Congress to act?
Well, the president would certainly like to see Congress act on universal background checks, on an assault weapons ban, a number of the pieces of legislation that are currently, I shouldn't say working their way through Congress, but are currently alive in Congress. But he's not going to wait. And his message to the American people is he's going to take steps that he has the power to take as president to reduce gun violence, to put in place measures that will reduce the likelihood of criminals having access to guns on the streets. There are authorities any president has, and he's going to take steps to do that, even as he pushes for legislation to move forward.
So beyond the announcements today, he is preparing or considering additional steps that could tackle some of these issues?
Well, I think we're going to focus on the announcements he's making today, a lot of which are on gun violence and gun violence prevention measures. I don't have anything beyond that to preview, but there are some significant steps he's certainly announcing this afternoon.
And just one more question on how the funding for all of this works. You're allowing state and local governments to reallocate some of the COVID-19 relief funds to hire more police officers, invest in other areas to combat this rising crime. But when Republicans pitched that idea to try and pay for some of an infrastructure plan, the White House said that money was already allocated. So what's the difference?
Well, the money was always allocated in state and local authority to state and local governments. One of the authorities they could always have taken was to ensure there were more cops on the beat, more police in place, and that's something we have always said was a part of the plan and the proposal. I don't know why Republicans opposed that or why that would have prompted them to vote against the package. Go ahead.
Just to follow up on Mary's first question, public safety can be a potent political issue. To what degree, if any, has the politics played a role in the decision to really try and get out in front of things today?
Well, the president has been very consistent in his views over the course of decades. He has never been for defunding the police. He has always been a supporter of ensuring that local community policing is funded and adequately supported by the federal government. He's also been a longtime advocate for decades and leader on addressing gun violence. So this is actually a continuity of his leadership on these issues over the course of decades. Now he has taken steps since president on each of these issues as well, including supporting funding, proposing funding in his own budget for community policing. And this is just an opportunity to put additional meat on the bones.
And then two more quick ones. You've answered this before, but just to make sure I understand red lines in the elusive search for pay-fors that are amenable to everybody. User fees on electric vehicles, is that in the same category as indexing the gas tax from your guys' perspective in these negotiations?
Yes. We are not for a Ford F-150 tax. I'm not sure why others are.
Good for you. And then quickly, given the tempo of some of the Taliban offensives that we've seen in Afghanistan, are there contingency plans at work right now to either move troops out faster, or perhaps more importantly, embassy officials, folks that the U.S. plan to keep on the ground if they advance much quicker than perhaps was initially thought?
Well, first I would say that our Department of Defense is overseeing an orderly withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan and doing that at a pace that, in their view, will ensure their safety and ensure we are doing it in a way that's effective and in a coordinated manner with the government. I will say that while in general we are seeing elevated attacks on DSF and Afghan government versus a year ago, we have not seen an increase in attacks on our military or presence since February 2020. And we also assess that had we not begun to draw down, violence would have increased against us as well after May 1st, because that was what the Taliban was clearly conveying. So the status quo, in our view, was not an option. In terms of personnel and others on the ground, that's certainly something that our State Department and our team takes very seriously and assesses whether there is a need to take any additional action. And I would certainly defer to them on any additional preview they do on that front. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. We understand that the administration plans to replace the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's federal regulator after the Supreme Court ruling that has now made it easier for the president to install his preferred overseer. Do you have a comment on that?
That's correct, given the Supreme Court ruling this morning, but I don't have any timeline for you on when that nomination will be made.
Are there any preferred candidates?
I don't have any candidates to preview. When we're ready to announce one, we will announce one.
Okay. And any comment on the on Russia firing warning shots and dropping bombs to chase a British warship out of the waters? Moscow now claims that in the Black Sea that they claim belongs to Russia.
I would point you to the British. We don't have any more comment on it from here.
And one question on voting rights. We've been kind of talking to a lot of voting rights and civil rights activists who are saying that the president isn't just simply doing enough on the issue and is betraying black voters who actually helped him get into the office by not doing absolutely everything he can. And he's instead spending his time negotiating infrastructure with Republicans. How would you respond to that criticism?
Who's saying that?
A lot of civil rights activists and voting activists.
Like who?
We've spoken to several groups and outfits. I mean, I can reach out to you with names after the briefing.
Sure. That sounds good. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. A number of lawmakers have asked the administration to extend the federal moratorium on evictions, which expires at the end of the month. Is that something the administration is considering, and why or why not?
Sure. Well, let me first say that that would be a decision, the decision to extend the eviction moratorium will be made by the CDC based on public health conditions, and we certainly wouldn't get ahead of their assessment. As you know, the eviction moratorium expires on June 30th, hence I think your question. It was always intended to be temporary, and the president remains focused on ensuring that Americans who are struggling through no fault of their own have an off-ramp once it ends. Hence, we've also worked to take additional steps to ensure people are getting the support they need to stay in their homes, whether they are renters or homeowners. But we'd certainly defer to the CDC on their decision and their timeline. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. The Miami Police Chief, Art Acevedo, expressed concern, disappointment that his association wasn't invited to the discussion. His association represents dozens of the largest city police forces, the major cities chief association. I just wanted to ask why the group wasn't invited, considering the role that they would likely be part of it.
Well, I think as we were putting together the roundtable that the president is taking part in today, we tried to have a diverse group of individuals representing a range of interests from across the country who have all played an active and vital role in addressing crime and crime prevention across the country. It is not meant to diminish anyone, including the individual you mentioned, and I'm sure we will be closely engaged with them and others who are not a part of this roundtable.
One more question
Sure.
on the crime and gun prevention effort. This effort involves redirecting some of the relief aid to these measures, and it gives wide latitude for spending that money in certain areas. But the Biden administration largely opposed redirecting relief funds for infrastructure projects. There were some limited exceptions, water and sewer, but why was it not okay for infrastructure, or limited for infrastructure, but it is more okay for this area?
I think this is similar to the question Mary just asked. I mean, it has always been the case that ensuring funding was used by state and local authorities to keep cops on the beat was always a part of what was allowed in the parameters of the spending. And that is something that a number of communities, as I outlined at the beginning, did take the steps to do. So this is just giving additional guidance on how to use the funds. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. On the meeting later today between Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and White House officials, what is the White House's message to them going to be with regard to the infrastructure talks? So you're going to insist on continuing going down the bipartisan route, or is this going to be a decision point where they may sort of kick the tires and go ahead with reconciliation on that?
Well, we've always seen this, or seen this for some time, I should say, not always, as a two-track strategy, right? So there are different discussions and negotiations happening today. One track, the American Jobs Plan, or big components of it, is a part of the infrastructure negotiations that we're discussing. Steve Ricchetti, Louisa Terrell, Brian Deese, right now with members who are part of that bipartisan discussion. Later tonight is a discussion that will also include Shalanda Young, also include Susan Rice and others. That's a discussion in part about the budget reconciliation process, the second track. And that track will include the American Families Plan and components that are not a part of the negotiation. So we've been saying two tracks. Today is an example of two tracks actually moving forward at one time in one day.
Which track is moving more smoothly right now?
They're both moving at a rapid pace. They're both moving. We know that we're at a later stage, obviously, in the bipartisan negotiations. You all know that. And obviously, we want to make progress over the next couple of days. We're in an earlier stage of the budget reconciliation process. That's because that's how that process works. But it's important to keep both tracks going.
And then just one more for you on, I just wanted to follow up if you had any answer from yesterday about whether President Biden discussed interest rates with Fed Chairman Powell and other financial regulators.
The interest rates, as you know, are under the purview of the Federal Reserve. I gave you an overview of what was discussed in the meeting and don't have anything else to add to that.
On the For the People Act, you said this week that it would be the fight of this presidency. The president said last night the fight is not over. Now that the Senate has put itself on the record, how do you see this fight playing out in the 117th Congress on the floor? Is going to be won on the floor before the end of this Congress?
We'll see. I don't think we can assess that quite yet. And I think what's important to know is that the president's going to keep fighting for federal legislation. The vice president is going to keep fighting for federal legislation. Leader Schumer and others have also made clear, I think, on the floor last night, they're going to continue to look for paths forward. We will see what that looks like, but we're still assessing that in the coming days. What the president will also talk about, though, next week is not that fight, but also what we can do in states around the country, what we can do through a range of the authorities that the federal government has. Because for all of these, our objective is to make it easier to vote, make it more accessible to vote, and there's a lot of ways to do that, even as we're continuing to fight for federal legislation.
I want to ask you another question about the border. You said that a great deal of progress has been made. Border Patrol statistics show something close to 900,000 interactions or encounters on the southwest border so far this fiscal year, 170,000 odd per month the last 3 months. Is that where you're measuring progress? You spoke of the unaccompanied minors, but what about the influx of people? The vice president was tasked with the diplomatic efforts there. Has that been successful? And how are you measuring that success?
Well, first, I think the vice president has made a number of announcements about coordinated efforts with countries in the region, in the Northern Triangle, through her leadership in that area. And we'll be able to assess over time what it looks like in terms of migration numbers. I was pointing to the fact that a couple of months ago, we were looking at very overcrowded Border Patrol facilities. We were looking at kids waiting for far too long in those facilities, and there being a timeline of getting kids to vetted family members that wasn't up to our bar. There has certainly been progress made in that regard, but the work is ongoing. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. My colleagues are reporting that the U.S. intelligence community concluded last week that the government of Afghanistan could collapse as soon as 6 months after the American withdrawal is completed. What is your reaction to that, and do you think that would also factor into speeding up an evacuation, especially for Afghans who helped the U.S.?
Well, let me first say on SIVs, on special immigrant visas, and these are individuals who have played an incredibly courageous role in helping the United States at various times over the course of our recent history. We are processing and getting people out at a record pace. We are working with Congress right now to streamline some of the requirements that slow this process down, and we're doing the kind of extensive planning for potential evacuation should that become necessary. So we're continuing to evaluate what our options are there, continuing to take steps forward, and certainly we want to take every step we can take from the federal government to treat all of these courageous individuals as they deserve.
Is there a reaction on that intelligence community's assessment at all, that the government could collapse within 6 months of the U.S. withdrawing?
I don't have any more assessment beyond the intelligence community.
About Afghanistan, please.
Go ahead.
Yes, as you know, President Ghani will be here on Friday, while President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah are visiting Washington, D.C. Taliban still continue their attack in all over Afghanistan. Do you think that President Biden committed to a stronger long-term support for Afghan people, especially Afghan military, because Afghan people has a high expectation from this trip, President?
I would say I don't anticipate, the timeline for withdrawal is not going to change by September, which of course is overseen by our Department of Defense. A part of their discussion on Friday will certainly be the President reiterating his commitment to work with the government of Afghanistan to continue to provide humanitarian support over the horizon security, work that he committed to when he made this announcement, and I'm sure they'll discuss this during their meeting on Friday. Go ahead, Francesca. Go ahead.
I've got a couple for you.
Sure.
Firstly, on the Vice President's trip to the border, why does the White House view this as the appropriate time for that visit?
Well, I think, Francesca, the decision on the timing was made in coordination with the Department of Homeland Security. As we've said from the beginning, we didn't want to have anyone visit at a time where it'd be disruptive to efforts and progress being made on the ground. But they made that assessment, and she had said just a few weeks ago that she'd be open to going to the border if at the appropriate time.
And earlier today, the White House announced that 15 jurisdictions would participate in its community violence intervention program. Do you anticipate that list expanding to include other cities like Kansas City, which has grappled with gun violence and has been engaged with the White House on this issue?
That's a great question, and you're right that it was 15 cities that we announced, or 15 jurisdictions that we announced this morning. Those jurisdictions we will announce, I guess I should say, later this afternoon. They stepped forward to join the collaborative because they're committed to using these strategies as a tool to reducing the scourge of gun violence. They have also designated a portion of their American Rescue Plan state and local funding, or another source of public funding to support CVI efforts, and have committed to city leadership and infrastructure such as leading local efforts through an Office of Neighborhood Safety. We're calling for more cities to follow these jurisdictions' lead, and certainly we'd welcome engagement and a desire to follow those trends as well.
And lastly, is the White House worried that its non-infrastructure agenda is being stymied to the point that it could have a negative impact on Democrats competing in next year's elections?
You mean our budget reconciliation process we're meeting about today?
No, I'm talking about the $15 minimum wage, voting rights, there's ongoing disputes over child care, other elements of the Families Plan, immigration reform. There's a number of different things.
I will say that the American Families Plan is a part of the budget reconciliation discussion and process. That's an historic investment in childcare and community college and universal pre-K, a number of areas that are of huge priority to the president as well as many Democrats. I think ultimately, I'm not going to assess 18 months from the midterm elections what that looks like, but the most important topics on the minds of the American people are COVID and the economy, and we're certainly moving forward on all fronts. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Jen. First, a question on Afghanistan. The Afghani leaders who are coming to meet with the president on Friday are going to want specifics about U.S. support to secure the governance and human rights gains that have been brought for the last 20 years there. Can the president guarantee that those gains won't be lost?
The president can guarantee that we will continue to support humanitarian assistance, support for progress, human rights progress that's been made on the ground, and a range of investments the United States have made that we've already committed to continuing.
Has he determined how much money that is needed?
Over the course of time, that's going to be done on kind of a year-by-year assessment.
Sort of in the next year, then? Is there any sort of estimate there?
Beyond our budget, I don't have anything more beyond our budget.
On crime, I just wanted to ask quickly if you could give us any details about who helped shape the president's crime plan. You know, was there input from various activists, perhaps from the Floyd family?
it was certainly driven, of course, by the President of the United States, who oversees all of our policies here, and driven by policy leaders within the government, from Susan Rice, Cedric Richmond, there's obviously economic components, Gene Sperling, Brian Deese, and they certainly do assess and engage with a range of activists and leaders around the country, but I don't have any more detail to read out for you. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Just really quickly, on the Vice President, there's a lot of discussion today about the Vice President's role in immigration, but I was wondering if you could outline any of her involvement in the last few moments on infrastructure, a different topic that is sort of in the closing stage right now. Has her portfolio there sort of gotten lower as other things have risen, or can you just give us the sort of state of play?
Sure. Well, I would say that the negotiations are primarily being led at a staff level by Louisa Terrell, Steve Ricchetti, and Brian Deese. And again, if we're at the point where we've made enough progress, so the President will invite them here, and I'm sure the Vice President would be a part of that. But they've really been led at the staff level over the past couple of days, and if there's calls that warrant the Vice President or the President making, certainly they would make them. But that's really what where the action has been over the last several days. Go ahead.
Thanks. Just to follow up my colleague's question about the eviction moratorium.
Sure.
There's some reporting that there's a 1-month extension that's going to come out pretty soon. I know you said you don't want to get ahead of the CDC, but the CDC is punting all of our questions back to you. So is there anything
That's confusing. Sorry.
So is there anything you can tell us about whether a 1-month extension is to be expected?
I don't have anything I can confirm for you from here today.
Okay, and then on guns, all advocates are saying there should be a gun czar. Is that something that's still being considered by the White House? One person that's responsible and spearheading this work on gun reform?
The President's responsible. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Jen. For some months, lawmakers of both parties have been asking the administration to prohibit polysilicon from coming into the country from China because it's being made in Xinjiang. It's a key material, as you may know, for solar panels. So is there some concern that prohibiting that from China could hurt the President's net zero goals, or what are you looking at it doing in regards to this from the human rights perspective?
Well, first let me say that in Cornwall, just 2 weeks ago, G7 countries committed to ensuring that global supply chains are free from the use of forced labor, which was a significant statement and agreement among G7 countries. And so as a part of that, you can expect that the United States will continue to hold those who engage in forced labor accountable, and that we will continue to remove goods made from local forced labor from our supply chains. As you also know, and I think this is the root of your question, we also remain committed to making progress internationally, domestically and internationally, on addressing the climate crisis. But we think we can certainly do both. I don't have anything yet to announce as it relates to specific products, or substantive, I should say, that are planned. But we'll see if we have more on that in the coming days. Oh, okay, great. We have to gather for the event. Thanks, everyone, so much. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.
Oh.